Jose Guerreña is a Marine who served 2 tours in Iraq. On the morning of May 5, 2011, Guerreña was asleep in his bedroom after working the graveyard shift. He awoke to the sound of his wife, Vanessa, screaming. After telling his wife and youngest son to hide in the closet, Guerreña grabbed his military weapon and walked out to the hallway. Police, who were conducting a drug raid, shot 71 bullets and hit Guerreña, who had never disengaged his safety, 22 times. While Guerreña lay on the floor bleeding, Vanessa called 911.
Okay, go ahead. This is the sheriff's department. Ma'am, this is the sheriff's department. Who is outside your home? I need to know who is outside your home. Can you look out the window?
I think it's the SWAT, but they're... Oh my God.
Okay, so can you please open the door for them?
It's open. It's open. They're open it.
After removing Guerreña's wife and son from the house, police refused to allow paramedics to treat Guerreña for more than an hour. During that hour, Guerreña bled to death in his own home. Police found nothing incriminating inside the house. Most Americans know people who've struggled with drug abuse, and we all want to keep drugs away from our children. But what kind of drug policy will most effectively provide help to those who need it and keep our children safe? There are many possible approaches, but for the past 40 years, the U.S. government has maintained the same policy: total prohibition. Most of us take the drug war for granted. In fact, more than half of all Americans are too young to remember when and how it all started.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Why did Nixon declare his war on drugs? Thanks to the fact that Nixon secretly taped his conversations, we can get a glimpse of Nixon's motivations.
No. You think the Russians allow no? Hell no, none of they know none of they get catch them. They send them up. You see, homosexuality, no, immorality generally. These are the enemies of strong societies. That's why the communists, the left-wingers, are pushing each other. They're trying to destroy us.
It was political, and it was used as a way to go after the student protesters, the anti-war protesters, and the hippies.
You peel back the history, and this whole thing started from a racist perspective.
This is what Richard Nixon said, according to Haldeman. He says, this is in the late 60s, right after the Civil Rights Movement. He says, you know, the problem is really the blacks. And what we have to do is to devise a system to deal with that while not appearing to. Hence, the war on drugs.
Well, you know, Nixon's such a mixed story because his support for drug treatment was really substantial and was admirable in many ways compared to everybody who's come after him. But the other part, of course, was the massive crackdown.
Federal agents in Florida today talked up the nation's largest coke bust ever.
While the feds were busy cracking down on drugs, 11 states decriminalized marijuana, making possession a minor offense rather than a criminal act. And when Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, it appeared that the war on marijuana might be coming to an end.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana, leaving the states free to adopt whatever laws they wish concerning marijuana.
A 1978 scandal surrounding allegations that Carter's drug advisor, Peter Bourne, had snorted cocaine at a Christmas party derailed Carter's decriminalization hopes, and instead, the drug war continued to escalate. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he got tough on drugs.
Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted, and nearly $250 million of their assets were seized by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Okay, last time. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
And while taxpayer dollars flowed to drug warriors, Nancy Reagan spearheaded prevention efforts with her Just Say No campaign.
There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use.
I am Mike Tyson, a professional fighter. You can keep drugs out of your life and knock them out of society by saying no. Say no to drugs.
After being elected in 1988, George Bush got tough on drugs too.
Our 1990 drug budget totals almost $8 billion, the largest increase in history.
Look, everybody wants to be cool, but doing it with crack isn't just wrong. It could be dead wrong.
We've already transformed a national attitude of tolerance into one of condemnation. But the war on drugs will be hard won, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, child by child.
They want you to believe this is some kind of knights in shining armor, battle of good versus evil.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale.
In 1992, admitted pot smoker Bill Clinton was elected president, and he got tough on drugs too.
We submitted the biggest drug budget ever. We have dramatically increased control and enforcement at the border. We supported a crime bill that had 60 death penalties, including the death penalty for drug kingpins.
When George W. Bush was elected in 2000, he followed in his father's footsteps. And in the wake of 9/11, he launched a propaganda campaign attempting to link drug users to terrorists.
You killed me.
What?
There's a bomb. I was going to school.
What did that have to do with me?
You brought drugs.
As the feds continued to escalate the war on drugs, states began passing laws allowing the medicinal use of marijuana. Predictably, the feds under Bush cracked down on medical marijuana dispensaries, arguing the federal law trumps state law. In 2007, a solid majority of Americans supported the medicinal use of marijuana. Mitt Romney, however, did not.
I have muscular dystrophy. That's completely against my DNA.
I'm sorry to hear that.
My question for you is, will you arrest me and my doctors if I get medical marijuana prescribed?
I'm not in favor of medical marijuana being
So will
legal
you
in the
have
country.
me arrested?
Hi. How are you?
Of course, waging war isn't free, and the amount of taxpayer dollars devoted to the drug war has increased significantly since Nixon declared war.
If one wants to compare the drug war of the late 60s, early 70s to today, start off with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In 1967, the lead federal drug control agency, I think its budget was $3 million. Now the budget of its successor agency, the DEA, is over $2 billion a year.
Do you realize that half of what we spend on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons is drug-related?
How much money in total has the U.S. government spent waging its war on drugs?
The best estimate, it was one that was come up by the AP, it was that we've spent roughly $1 trillion on this war on drugs.
Okay, so drug prohibition has been expensive, but has it reached its goals?
What we've observed over time is that the U.S. has sometimes successfully pushed down on the production and distribution from some countries, and what happens in 6 months, a year or two, is the production moves somewhere else. I think of it as being like a waterbed. You can press the water down on one part of the bed, but it's going to pop up someplace else.
You know, one of the goals was to keep drugs out of the country, and what demonstrates that we can't is that more tonnage is coming in, and prices are going down.
I held the record for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California back in 1978. 75 kilos of heroin, 160 pounds, which was and is a whole lot of heroin. Does anyone have a concept of what the drug prosecution record is today in the Central District of California? 18 tons of cocaine in one place.
You can buy almost any illegal drug in any city in this country, almost any neighborhood in this country, 24/7.
Marijuana usage rates vary over time. But it's hard to argue that the war against marijuana has been effective when daily use rates among 18-year-olds are the highest they've been in 30 years.
We're giving very mixed signals here about marijuana as to whether or not it's something that really is condemned by society or not. And so it doesn't surprise me that you've seen a spike in the usage.
And for hard drugs like heroin, usage rates have remained essentially flat for decades.
The only drug that we've been effective in reducing use is nicotine, tobacco. And you know what? We didn't send a single person to prison or fire a single shot to do that.
Obviously, we're no closer now than we were then.
They haven't made a dent. They haven't made a dent since Nixon made marijuana Schedule I drug in 1970. They're never going to make a dent.
This is a colossal failure.
It's really no surprise that drug prohibition has failed to achieve its goals. After all, alcohol prohibition didn't work either.
Alcohol prohibition and drug prohibition are very similar in most important respects. Okay? In both cases, we have a substance that a significant fraction of the population seems to want to consume. And it follows from economics that if you try to outlaw such a substance, there's going to be a black market that supplies it.
What you saw was people switching from beer and wine to hard liquor because it was much more compact and lucrative to traffic in that rather than something that was 96 or 95% water. What else happened? Al Capone and organized crime and rising levels of violence and corruption, overflowing jail cells and courthouses, tens of millions of Americans violating the law and being identified as criminals, a general deterioration in support for law and order. Now flash forward to today, it's the same thing except on a much more massive scale.
Can we win the war on drugs?
Every single sort of few years, we hear the prohibitionists in Washington say, well, if we just keep trying, if we just devote a little bit more money, a few more, more arrests, more military, we'll be able to win the war. And of course, it's never been true. If you look at places that are very repressive, that are not shy about using really, really strong tactics, prisons being one example, okay? There's tons of drugs in prison.
I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
But then, in 2008, another admitted drug user emerged on the national scene.
What I'm not going to be doing is using Justice Department resources to try to circumvent state laws on this issue.
When Barack Obama was elected president, medical marijuana advocates had reason to hope for change.
What the president said during the campaign, you'll be surprised to know, will be consistent with what we will be doing here in law enforcement.
In March of 2009, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder announced that the Obama administration would not target patients or caregivers who are in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. After years of frequent raids under Bush, medical marijuana patients and caregivers could finally relax, at least for a few days.
The DEA raided a medical marijuana club in San Francisco, and this comes just days after the Obama administration suggested that it would ease up.
In October 2011, federal attorneys stepped up efforts to crack down on dispensaries in California, where medical marijuana has been legal for 15 years. Aaron Sandusky got into the medical marijuana business in 2009 after the real estate market collapsed.
I was in the mortgage business for 20 years. We were too small to bail instead of too large to fail.
In November 2011, DEA agents raided all 3 of Sandusky's clubs, as well as his grow room.
Patients were handcuffed. Some of our senior patients were handcuffed and taken. They seized all of our assets, all of my personal assets. I got $60 in my pocket. That's it. I mean, what are they going to do to me? Throw me in jail? I guess.
In October of 2012, a jury convicted Sandusky for violating federal marijuana laws. Sandusky is currently facing a prison term of 10 years to life. Despite the assurances by the Obama administration, the feds are raiding more medical marijuana dispensaries than they did when Bush was president. In April 2012, the feds raided Oaksterdam University, a school for medical marijuana professionals.
We had a multiple agency federal raid on Oaksterdam University, as well as our museum and the gift shop, and Richard Lee's qualified dispensary that's actually permitted by the city of Oakland. It was a tough day for Oaksterdam.
Oaksterdam University's founder, Richard Lee, was the principal sponsor of Prop 19, California's initiative to legalize marijuana that received 46% of the vote in 2010.
President Obama, and I'm very disappointed in you.
I have to say, Obama in the second half of his term has just been a serious disappointment.
Right now, he is the toughest president that we have ever had on the war on drugs. Where did that come from?
It seems like he kind of turned his back. The drug czar today, Kurlikowski, sounds just like his predecessors, mouthing the same old kind of foolish nonsense we heard from others under Clinton and the Bushes.
In 2011, drug czar Gil Kurlikowski appeared before a House subcommittee to justify a $15 billion budget to fight the drug war in 2012. Congressman Dennis Kucinich chaired the committee.
So what parts of your budget are the most effective and cost-effective in reducing illicit drug use?
I think that is the question that everyone would like to see answered.
Well, that's the one I'm asking you, and you're the director. You want to give it a try?
Right.
Kurlikowski eventually said that the ONDCP's prevention and treatment programs are the most effective. But in this year's budget, supply-side drug interdiction efforts make up 60% of the budget.
Is crack worse for a person than marijuana?
I believe all illegal drugs are bad.
Is methamphetamine worse for somebody's health than marijuana?
I don't think any illegal drug
is good. Heroin worse for someone's health than marijuana?
Again, all
I mean, either
drugs,
yes, no, or I don't know. I mean, if you don't know, you can look this up. You should know this as the chief administrator for the Drug Enforcement Agency.
I think the government is losing a lot of resources in this foolish war. I want the president to know that his war on drugs, if he wants to carry out Nixon's policies, then he should do what the other presidents have done, is just blindly keep investing in this war on drugs.
Am I willing to pursue a decriminalization strategy as an approach? No.
The war on drugs is not just a metaphor. Drug prohibition is a literal war against people who buy and sell illegal drugs. And as in any war, too often people get hurt.
I cried and I cried. I couldn't believe how much I cried.
10 years is a long, long time.
Just overwhelmed, just happy to be there, blessed day,
In 2001, Cory May shot and killed police officer Ron Jones during a drug raid that went horribly wrong.
Cory May was 21 when the raid initially happened. He was living in Prentiss, Mississippi, in Jefferson Davis County. He just a couple weeks earlier had moved into this yellow duplex with his girlfriend and their child, 18-month-old girl named Coriana.
Basically what this case hinges on is the information supposedly received by the Prentiss Police Department, Ron Jones being a member of it, from the most rabidly racist person that I've ever met in my life. And that's saying something, because I was born and raised in Mississippi.
So what you're saying is, then, are you saying that you were the informant that Ron used in the case? Okay.
The confidential informant's name was Randy Gentry.
Based on his information that Cory was a big drug dealer in the town of Prentiss, Prentiss Police Department decided they would do their own SWAT raid on Cory's side of a duplex. Cory was sitting in his living room, had been watching TV. The television was still on. Cory was in an easy chair, had gone to sleep.
It's about 12:30 in the morning. He wakes up to the sound of men trying to break into his home. And this is, going by his own testimony at his trial. He said he was, terrified. He moved to the bedroom where the baby was sleeping on the bed. grabbed a gun that he kept on the nightstand, laid down next to her, and sort of hoped the noises would go away. The police moved around to the back, and eventually the bedroom door gets kicked open.
And Cory, not knowing what was going on, fired 3 shots.
Had I heard police, it would have never happened, you know. Only time I heard police was after the fact. Police, you just out of office. That's when I immediately put the gun down and slid away, you know. I'm telling you, I'm sorry, I didn't know, you know what I'm saying?
One of the bullets hit Officer Ron Jones just under his flak jacket and killed him.
What Cory knew or didn't know was the crux of the case. I mean, you can't find him guilty of anything if, in fact, he did not know who was coming in his back door.
Putting yourself in that situation, you know, you can't say what you will do or you won't do, you know. But everybody gonna try to protect themselves, you know, their child, you know, every man.
Cory never had a speeding ticket in his life prior to this. The big drug dealer in Jeff Davis County, Mississippi, I think they searched his duplex 3 times when they finally found a roach, what was left of a marijuana cigarette.
The cop, Ron Jones, was the son of the town police chief. The cop was white, Cory was black. This is in a very sort of racially charged area of Mississippi. And he was charged with capital murder, which is the knowing, intentional killing of a police officer. And he was charged, he was convicted, he was sentenced to death.
The day that I heard those words, death row, in that courtroom, I guess it didn't sink in at that moment.
You just can't believe that they thinking about killing you for something that was an accident, you know what I'm saying? No.
In 2006, Balco's reporting on the Cory May story grabbed the attention of many people, including Abe Pafford of the Covington & Burling law firm in Washington, D.C. Pafford's firm generously offered to work on May's appeal on a pro bono basis. At that point, May had already been in prison and separated from his children, Cory Jr. and Tacoriana, for 5 years.
They saw him very little. Of course, they weren't around him, and when they did see him, it was through 4 inches of bulletproof glass. And that's eerie enough in and itself for lawyers to go to. I mean, it gives me the heebie-jeebies, and I can't imagine how it would affect your family, particularly young children.
I think I might have missed 5 visits, 6 that I didn't go out of the whole 10 years. But I went up and down that highway faithfully.
Eventually, Cory's death sentence was thrown out. He was resentenced to life without parole. A few years later, the Mississippi Supreme Court granted him a new trial, said he should have been able to argue at his trial that he was defending his daughter that night. And rather than retry him, the prosecutors decided basically to offer him a plea where he would plead to manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of time served.
A black man on death row for having killed a white cop. He's now at home with his freedom.
Cory May has his freedom, but as every ex-con knows, life after prison isn't easy.
Cory's still a convicted felon. Very difficult for a convicted felon to get employment. Very difficult for a convicted felon that's convicted of what Cory was convicted of to find anybody that wants to have much to do with him, certainly in the majority white community. Let's just put it that way.
I don't hold no grudges, 10 years, I never get those years back. I don't hold no grudge or seek no revenge, because revenge is not mine, you know what I'm saying? They have to answer for what they did to a higher power, you know what I'm saying? And I'm okay with that,
Ron Jones and Cory May are casualties of a war on drugs that has become increasingly violent over the past few decades.
So we've seen a huge explosion in the number of SWAT teams that exist across the country and the number of actual raids that are carried out.
In the early 1980s, criminologist Peter Kraska began sending out surveys to police departments asking how often they deploy SWAT teams.
And basically Kraska estimates that before he started sending a survey out, SWAT teams were deployed a few hundred times a year in the U.S. And these were for hostage situations and bank robberies and kidnappings and escaped fugitives.
Somewhere along the line, we just established this blanket policy that every time we serve a search warrant, we're going to use a SWAT team. That's not a good thing.
it's a dangerous situation for law enforcement. I think that they should take reasonable precautions so that they themselves don't become a victim.
Search warrant!
Nebraska stopped doing the survey in 2005. It was up to about 50,000 SWAT deployments per year in the U.S. And the vast majority, Nebraska has estimated, the vast majority of these raids are to serve drug warrants. Units that look like soldiers, that are trained like soldiers, that use military tactics, that are told they're fighting a war. About 150 times a day, they're sent into homes across the country.
Dynamic entries are violent. People get hurt.
The military, soldiers, have a very specific mission, and that's to annihilate a foreign enemy, right? Their job is to kill people and break things. A police officer's job is to protect our rights. It's to keep the peace.
This drug work is eroding the pride that we've had in law enforcement.
There are entire communities now who don't trust the people who are charged with basically protecting them.
The tougher we get with regard to drug crime, literally the softer we get with regard to the prosecution of everything else.
In the 1960s, the clearance rate for murder cases was around 90%. Today, only 65% of homicides are resolved.
Haven't we become smarter? Don't we have better technology? Don't we have these computers and databases? Don't we have DNA testing?
If you're a police chief or a law enforcement officer, and you have a choice between investigating a really ugly, violent, or predatory crime or domestic abuse, where there's nothing there that's going to help your bottom line of your agency budget, or you can target some poor schnook who is growing marijuana in his backyard and maybe seize his property. Unfortunately, many law enforcement personnel make the wrong choice about where to target the resources.
Asset forfeiture policy basically, any property, money, cash, whatever that the police find that they can even loosely sort of associate with drug activity, they can confiscate, they can auction it off. And in most states, the money goes back to the local police department.
All in all, police netted $4.3 million in cash, $50 million of marijuana, and a little something extra to help those agencies investigating in the streets.
It is a win for the taxpayers of Marion County and Central Indiana.
Why have police departments in the U.S. become so militarized in recent decades?
Basically, since about the early 80s, we've seen the federal government lay out a lot of incentives, and actually state governments also, that have encouraged the use of SWAT teams.
This wasn't initially the job of local police to get into the drug trade. We were literally bribed by the federal government to help them with their drug enforcement effort.
And when you start pouring that money into the criminal justice system in that way, what you start getting is cops going, what can we buy next? Or what can we buy with the money we just forfeited from somebody who was involved in drugs? And you start getting them buying tanks and all sorts of fancy hardware and keeping fancy cars that they've seized.
I think the drug war definitely twists and perverts police priorities. I think they spend an inordinate amount of time chasing down sort of low-level drug offenders at the expense of policing actual crimes with actual victims.
I think it's time for state and local law enforcement to get out of the drug enforcement business and get back to the business of protecting people, protecting the citizens of our communities.
Every war has prisoners, and the drug war is no exception. Hundreds of thousands of non-violent Americans are currently in prison for being involved in the drug trade.
My name is Greta Moss. I was born 10 days after my dad went to prison. I was late and had to be induced to be born. My mom says it was because I was waiting for him to come home. I'm now 12 and a half, and I'm still waiting.
In the mid-'80s, Robert Moss and several friends got into the business of buying and selling marijuana.
It may sound perverse to some people out there, but I always took pride in providing a good product at a good price. I always had an end game, and that was to make some seed money, capital, and redeploy the capital.
And then Robert met Lorianne.
We met it on a blind date at a football game in 1986.
That was another component, actually, of my leaving and quitting the business is because I fell in love with this woman, and I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her and start a family.
It was the happiest time of my life, and we were married and lived together only a year and a half before the trial began.
Moss shut down his operation in the spring of 1988, but a few of his colleagues decided to keep the business going for one more season.
Some of the people that didn't quit got caught at the border and named him.
Moss was indicted and went to trial in the fall of 1991. Despite the fact that Moss was not involved in the shipment that got busted at the border, Moss was found guilty of conspiracy to violate marijuana laws.
The day that our second child was due to be born was September 30th, and the verdict came down on that very day.
Robert and Lorianne had heard about the recently passed mandatory minimum and federal sentencing guidelines, but they had no idea how those laws would impact their lives.
Every drug has its own mandatory minimum attached to it. If you have any criminal history beyond a Category 1, you're no longer eligible for safety valve, and that means that the judge has to sentence you to a minimum of 5 years or 10 years, depending on the quantity, whether that judge wants to or not.
My husband got a sentence of 24 years and 9 months.
I really was too stunned to react. I just wouldn't accept it. My wife was upset. She started crying and screaming in the courtroom.
That's the worst day of my life. The most painful day of my entire life.
Moss's former colleagues gave him up in order to reduce their own sentences.
No one did more than 36 months. And I ended up doing more than 20 years.
I love my dad so much. He is a thoughtful, gentle man.
Since I was little, he taught me many things in prison visiting room. When we have to leave him, I'm always sad. I never want to say goodbye, but I have to. I wanted you to know that not everyone in prison is bad or deserves to be there. I wanted you to know that every man and woman in prison has a family, and almost all of them have children like me who love them.
For the past 20 years, Lorianne Moss has raised her daughters alone.
It's gonna be okay. Everything's gonna be, really, it will come together, and Daddy is gonna, complete us here.
In recent years, Lorianne, Greta, and Eve have lived in the Seattle area.
I did the best I could to make their lives as normal as possible, but this was like a cloud that was always hanging over us.
She is a very strong woman and made sure that we knew that my father was a good man and that he didn't deserve to be where he was.
She told us that our dad was in prison for selling a flower.
When we were little, we used to go to prison sometimes twice a week.
Hating to leave him there was the worst part. And being confused to why he can't come home with us.
My youngest daughter, Greta, she was maybe 3 years old when I asked her what she wanted from Santa. And she told me that all she wanted was her dad at home. Excuse me. It's obviously painful. And produces a resentment.
I'm angry, extremely angry.
I had never felt normal in my entire life. I always felt like there was something missing, and I didn't want people to think I had daddy issues,
Because we don't. We have government issues.
We have government issues.
On September 1st, 2011, Robert Moss was released from prison after serving 20 years.
I spent 20 years, of course, in prison. And these children grew up without a father at home. And for what? For what?
Robert Moss's story is far from unique.
If you now look at who's behind bars in America, you'll see violent criminals, you'll see people who committed theft and fraud, and then you'll see this massive population whose only offense was to consume, grow, buy, or sell some prohibited substance, even in the absence of doing any harm to anybody else.
We now have 2.3 million people behind bars in this country.
That's why the largest growing housing industry in this country is building of prisons.
The prison population explosion has occurred despite the fact that property and violent crimes in the U.S. have been declining since the early 90s.
There's something like 200,000 people in federal prisons, of which roughly half are there for a drug law violation, and hundreds of thousands of more in state prisons and local jails.
Today, the U.S. has around 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Violent criminals, of course, deserve to spend time in prison. But what about nonviolent drug offenders?
He was a nonviolent drug offender. He's never been anything but a nonviolent drug offender. But he was housed with murderers.
Gretchen Bergman is the founder of Moms United Against the Drug War.
My older son was arrested at 20 for possession of marijuana, which started this cycling through the system.
Bergman's son, a recovering heroin addict, first shot up heroin while serving time in prison for a marijuana violation.
And what happens when you put a non-violent person in prison? A violent person returns to you in your community.
There's a lot of gang stuff. I mean, I was shocked to find out that because my son is a white boy, then that means he's in the white sort of supremacist. I mean, because that's what it is. There's the Hispanics, there's the Asians, there's the blacks, and there's the whites. And if you're not in one of those, you're not protected.
The drug war has caused a lot of pain for a lot of people, but the war's effect on minority communities has been particularly tragic. Reverend Dennis Malone is an ex-con who now helps released prisoners readjust to life on the outside.
Minorities are not the only ones that are using drugs. But who gets arrested? And who gets sentenced?
They treat everybody in my community like they're crooks.
We've occupied communities, not for good reasons, but to go in and search people, search their cars, search their homes, violate their Fourth Amendment rights.
Sacramento is full of my relatives who've been, some of them incarcerated, some of them entrapped, some of them racially profiled.
Today, 1 out of every 8 black men in their 20s is either in prison or jail.
It's an extraordinary rate of incarceration, far exceeding the rate of incarceration of black men in apartheid South Africa, or for that matter, of anybody in the Soviet gulags of the 1930s.
Until 2011, people busted with powder cocaine had to have 100 times more cocaine by weight to get the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as people busted with crack cocaine.
As of November 1st of this year, Congress finally saw the light and reduced those penalties to 18-1 as opposed to 100-1.
That's an improvement, but the reform pales in comparison to the harm the drug war has caused to minority communities.
A lot of single parents are in the community in which I live. And this is for generations.
The ethnic people are almost the majority in California. And when you have that kind of talent going down the drain, instead of being turned into productive citizens for the state of California, California's losing big time.
We need a different approach. We can no longer afford to keep locking up people for non-violent drug offenses.
Why are we putting people in prison for non-violent drug offenses? What's the benefit to society from that?
The U.S. government's war on drugs is really a global war, and some of the bloodiest battles are now taking place across our southern border in Mexico.
Well, DEA is a global agency. It was when I was the administrator, and it still is. More DEA agents are serving overseas than any other agency of the U.S. government, save for the State Department itself.
People in the United States should understand things you do in the United States impact other people in very tremendous ways. The United States, of course, being the principal consumer of illegal drugs and simultaneously, contradictorily, the principal motor of the exportation of the moralistic, ideological commitment to absolute prohibition of drugs.
You will go through a period of violence and turmoil as these cartels are being broken up and destroyed. And that's basically what's happening in Mexico now.
When I look at Mexico today, it's like Chicago during the days of Al Capone times 50.
Yes, you've had a lot of successes. You have extradited more bad guys than ever before, with all the administrations prior to his combined. You have killed more bad guys than ever. You have seized more money and more property and more vehicles than ever before, but you have also punished a lot of the civilian people. And you have created a very uncertain environment, a very unsafe and insecure environment around the country.
In the name of the rule of law, they launch a campaign that 5 years later has created a situation where more than 50,000 people have been murdered.
And no place has experienced more violence than Ciudad Juarez. Juarez has a population of around 1.2 million people and is situated just across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. Just a few years ago, Juarez was a thriving border town.
Juarez used to be a vibrant town with lots of people, lots of El Pasoans and Americans walking over, going to the bars and the clubs, lots of El Pasoans seeking entertainment in Juarez. All those bars and clubs are now closed, boarded up. The city is deserted.
Because of the extraordinary violence in Juarez, many people like myself have stopped going over to Juarez, have stopped visiting Juarez.
In fact, even the mayor of Juarez spends his nights in El Paso, as do some of the cartel bosses.
I mean, it's really changed. And economically, it's devastated. We estimate that the city has lost a good 300 to 400,000 people.
Those who remain live in daily fear.
This man recently lost his job and can no longer afford a home. He and his family are considering squatting in one of the many abandoned condos in Juarez, but they're scared because this barrio, like most places in Juarez, is controlled by the gangs. Violence in Juarez is nothing new. In 2007, for example, 300 people were murdered in Juarez, while there were only 17 homicides across the border in El Paso. But the escalation of the drug war in Mexico has led to an explosion of violence. In 2010, an astonishing 3,000 people were murdered in Juarez, making the city the murder capital of the world. Sandra Rodriguez is a reporter at El Diario in Juarez.
In 2008, everything changed like in these 5 months, when everybody noticed that the killings that before were 1 per day, now were 10 per day, everywhere, in the bank, in the street, outside the school.
As the bodies piled up and the fear spread, things became increasingly difficult for Rodriguez and her colleagues.
A body is dropped on the scene. You can't go talking to people. Did you see the guys who did it? I mean, that's the kind of thing that, you don't know who you're talking to. Maybe someone's going to text message from their cell phone and say, hey, this reporter's asking questions. And the next thing you know, the vehicles come back, you get pulled into a Suburban with tinted windows, and you're never seen again.
It's been a challenge.
In 2008, El Diario crime beat reporter Armando Rodriguez was gunned down in his car. Rodriguez's 8-year-old daughter was in the passenger seat and witnessed the execution.
I suppose that he got killed because he knew everything.
In 2010, El Diario photographer Luis Carlos was gunned down as well. Neither case has been solved, but in Juarez, that's hardly a surprise.
At least in Juarez, we have 97% of impunity. So just 3% of the cases advance a little.
Felipe Calderon said in an interview with CNN that 90% of those who've been killed up to that date, it was in 2010, in the so-called drug war, were somehow involved. How does he know that? You don't know who that individual was yet. You don't know their name. You don't know anything about their lives. You don't know, were they a kidnap victim? Were they an extortion victim? Were they someone involved in, corner sales of marijuana? Are any of those things worthy the crime of capital punishment, or the death sentence?
How do you protest a criminal organization? So you go to the government, and you see that the government is incompetent, corrupt, that is not able to respond to anything, is not able to offer protection. So you take the only other choice left to you: flee or move indoors and protect yourself.
There's no justice at all for anybody, for the victims, for their families.
The municipal police, by and large, are so poorly paid, so ill-trained, and so thoroughly corrupt that the actual best thing that could possibly be done, and it's something that Calderon has proposed, is to simply eliminate the municipal police.
In 2008, hundreds of Juarez cops suspected of corruption were fired. Dozens of city officials involved in the purge were murdered in retaliation. Today, Juarez police are either employed by the drug cartels or they're in considerable danger. These skid marks were made by the car of a police comandante who was gunned down in late 2011 while driving along the Rio Grande, just a stone's throw from El Paso. 37 Juarez police officers were executed in 2011 alone. The Mexican army rolled into Juarez in 2008, ostensibly to take the war to the cartels, but their presence has only fueled the violence.
When you get the military to behave like cops, to patrol the streets, to seize property, to search homes and vehicles and papers and people, you're going to create a lot of human rights abuses.
Since Calderon declared his war on drugs in 2006, there have been more than 4,000 human rights complaints against the army, including allegations of kidnapping, rape, torture, and murder. As the situation in Mexico has deteriorated, Americans have grown increasingly concerned that the violence will spill over the border.
Where I think you will begin to see spillover violence is really not in a marketplace like El Paso, but in larger markets where, like Chicago and Atlanta and Oklahoma City and Dallas and Houston.
I would call on government and Congress here to pay attention to this issue and try to solve it. Because right now it's Mexico who is paying the price. But tomorrow it could be this nation paying a huge price by not solving this issue.
2 years ago, the Department of Justice came out and said, in over 230 communities in our country, we have the cartel where they have established themselves. 230 communities in our country. They've recently come out and said it's now over 1,000.
And how has the U.S. government responded to the escalating violence and corruption in Mexico?
The United States has increased its economic and military support to Mexico during Calderon's administration drastically.
The U.S. clearly bears significant responsibility because for 90 years it's been pressuring countries around the world to adopt and enforce prohibition.
It is a global issue, and the U.S. does need to exert, in my opinion, leadership.
The battle President Calderon is fighting inside of Mexico is not just his battle, it's also ours.
So where do we go from here?
Just like the moms in the 30s who wanted to end prohibition because of the gangland violence, because of the loss of lives and liberties, and all the same thing here again, only we have a 40-year failed war on drugs.
The drug war has failed, but what's the alternative? Is there a way to provide help to those with drug problems while at the same time keeping communities and our children safe? The alternative is called harm reduction. The basic idea is to try to help people with drug problems rather than treat them like criminals. Does harm reduction work? Fortunately, we have a wonderful real-world example in Portugal, a country that decriminalized all drugs 10 years ago.
Portugal has actually decriminalized all drug use, and they did that as a response to a heroin epidemic in the country.
A huge amount of money that had gone to putting its citizens into cages was freed up, and it enabled the government to provide meaningful treatment to people who wanted it. And so addicts were able to turn into non-drug users, and usage rates went down.
In the last 10 years, they've been able to document a 50% reduction in heroin use.
Now there's a virtual consensus across the political spectrum in Portugal that decriminalization has succeeded, and there's no movement to return to the criminalized framework.
I mean, what would it look like if the United States sent people to places like Portugal to learn, to listen, to study?
All around the world, more and more people are waking up to the fact that we need to take a fresh look at drug policy. Mexican poet Javier Sicilia, whose son was murdered by cartel members in 2011, is the figurehead of a massive group of people calling for change in Mexico. Even high-profile politicians are seeing the light.
And who says that drugs should be prohibited? I think that we should respect every single citizen's freedom and freedom of choice.
Another former Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, joined the Global Commission on Drug Policy in 2011. The commission is made up of political leaders, public intellectuals, and prominent business people who advocate decriminalizing drug use by those who do no harm to others. In November 2012, the citizens of Colorado and Washington voted to legalize marijuana and regulate it like alcohol.
We Coloradans have said, we don't want to use our resources in jail beds
going after adults possessing marijuana. That is wasteful.
I think Washingtonians are fed up with what hasn't been working and are ready to try something different.
Whether the federal government will attempt to overstep the 10th Amendment and prevent Colorado and ultimately Washington State as well from moving forward with these laws, we'll see.
If you really wanted to resolve this issue, you need to go to the Congress, and you have to convince enough legislators that it makes sense to legalize marijuana.
This is an issue that does really well under the light of day. To all those politicians that might be watching this clip, get some starch, man. Get some starch.
Up until this past century, for over 100 years they were legal. What you're inferring is, you know what? If we legalize heroin tomorrow, everybody's going to use heroin. How many people here would use heroin if it was legal? I bet nobody would put the hand, oh yeah, I need the government to take care of me. I don't want to use heroin, so I need these laws.
We'll win this. We will win this eventually. They will not, because they can't.
And I guarantee anyone who will listen that 2 years after we change away from this failed and hopeless policy, everybody will join arms, look back astonished, aghast that we could have perpetuated such a failed system for so long.
I don't like drugs. I never used drugs. But I know something's wrong with this war that we're in, and it has to end.
If you can, I hope that you can help change the laws and bring my dad home, where he belongs. Thank you for listening to my story.